Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hamjambo nyote. Good morning. Subaha wa naksan. Thanks for that's a lot more pleasant introduction than I would have done myself, but I will take it. This is indeed a very interesting moment, and I'm particularly honored by this invitation. I want to congratulate my brother, Proud, for putting this together as a way of adding more voice, but also building more agency for us as people of this region and people of this continent in making sure that tomorrow is no longer going to be written for us, but by us. Because for far too long, we've been passengers in our own vehicle. I've been tasked with discussing perhaps one of the issues that has beleaguered this continent for much of its post-colonial history. And still some of the concepts we are still grappling with, even as we seek to better ourselves in all manner of ways. And these concepts are the concepts of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination. And sometimes we use them a lot more loosely. But oftentimes, when we want to advance our personal interests, we want to use them a lot more jealously. Indeed, few questions have defined the history of the interstate relations, like that of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination. Europe's original sin against Africa not only reworked the social political architecture of the continent, but it also introduced political and organizational concepts that, for better or worse, have informed our approach to relations with each other, has fueled wars and conflict whose intellectual origins have roots in lands beyond our borders, and have remained the most contentious bonds in our search for African unity. To some, this may be interpreted as some harsh opinion against colonial architects. The trouble with such argument is that our statement above is factual, and an admission of fact does not negate its factuality. And yes, what we have seen is that in recent years have witnessed heated debates about the concepts of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination. The current conflicts in the international system have served to fuel these debates. Not to mention our neighborhood, what we have seen that took place just a few days ago, with, of course, the MOE between Addis Ababa and the case. And we can argue that the conflict in Ukraine, the anti-Western revolt in the Sahel, are also part of these discussions. But do we really understand the applicability of international law and diplomatic relations? How can we understand these concepts? How do they apply to the current international order? This is going to force us to have some background, mostly historical. And I understand many people get tired with history. Unfortunately, you can't move forward if you don't know where you're coming from. The concept of sovereignty is one of the most controversial ideas in political science, as well as history, and has always been closely associated with the concept of state, the concept of government, and the concept of independence, or the idea of independence. Going back to the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, that laid the foundation for the modern state system as we know it. Derived from a Latin word souverainous, and by extension a French word, souverainty, the term is originally understood to mean the supreme power. However, its actual application has often departed from that original traditional thinking. The last century, that's the 20th century, has seen important restrictions on the freedom of action of states begin to appear. Indeed, going back to the Hague Convention of 1899, just at the turn of the century, and 1907, it established rules governing the conduct of wars on land and sea. At the end of the First World War, the Covenant of the League of Nations, which is the forerunner of the United Nations, restricted the right to wage war. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, just a few years before Hitler came to power, it condemned the recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and its use as an instrument of national policy. These were later followed at the end of the Second World War by the United Nations Charter, which imposed the duty on member states to settle the international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security is not endangered. This was supplemented with an injunction in the Charter that members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat of the use of force, which is Article 2 of the Charter. However, the Charter also stated the UN is based on the principle of sovereign equality of member states. As a result, such developments, sovereignty has ceased to be considered synonymous with unrestricted power. States have come to accept a considerable body of law that limits their sovereign right to act as they please, especially in relation to other states. Conversely, new rules cannot arbitrarily and unlawfully be imposed upon a state without its consent, by the will of other states. In this way, a balance has been achieved between the needs of international society and the desire of states to protect their sovereignty to the maximum possible extent. It is worth noting that the 19th century distinction between fully sovereign states and sovereign categories of less sovereign units lost its importance under the United Nations. It was a practice that existed before the Second World. Emphasis was placed not on legal differences among colonies, protected states, protectorates, and states under occupation by another state, but the political distinction between self-governing and non-governing territories. Under the UN Charter, non-self-governing territories became a sacred trust, and the state administering them promised to develop towards self-government, which resulted in closer supervision of the administration by the United Nations, and in their speedy progress to self-government. For those who are familiar with history, this part of events, of course, explains the current quagmire you have in Palestine, but also may have fueled some of the controversies we have in the Horn of Africa. Once territories achieve self-government, as defined in resolution by General Assembly, supervision of the UN thereby ceased, even though independent status was not achieved. The reason I'm mentioning Palestine also in this discussion is because this is about AfroAsia. Now, someone asked me yesterday, how is it AfroAsia? Well, the Middle East is actually called West Asia, the last time I checked. In post-independent Africa, the concept of sovereignty was largely accepted from its standard understanding. Even though there was widespread desire to build a united Africa, the preference for strict interpretation of the concept militated against our efforts at uniting the continent, even as it kept the peace between the newly independent states. Now, That is a discussion about sovereignty and some of the products, but also how it has informed the current relations among our own states and nations. The second concept here that I'm going to talk about, and we'll have a Q&A answer, so I'm not going to be able to talk about everything in this presentation, is the concept of territorial integrity. I don't think there's a country in the world that has not invoked territorial integrity at any time in having trouble with its neighbor, or they perceived violation of that concept. The Peace of Westphalia in 1848 is considered to have established territorial integrity as a cornerstone of sovereignty. There were three aspects of a state: geography, sovereignty, territorial integrity, meaning also ability for you to be able to stay within certain defined borders that are inviolable. Yet, this did not necessarily reflect any absolute right of a particular territory. Indeed, the territorial exchange at the time remained common between states. In turn, these states were culturally diverse and politically disorganized, and people not collectively identified by state borders as we have today. The emergency of nationalism, and this is much about the 18th and the 19th century, and self-determination began to alter people's perception of the states in which they resided. Nationalism, on one hand, promoted the belief that territory belonged to a nation and the territorial integrity of a nation should be respected. It is plausible, therefore, to say that national identity is in large part dependent on territory because only territory provides a tangible evidence of a nation's existence and its historical roots. And a nation needs clearly demarcated national territory to demand its own state. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, the establishment of the League of Nations had ushered in a new era of international cooperation. The League's covenant, indeed, codified territorial integrity as a key principle of international law. However, the political conditions for maintaining the territorial status quo after the war were not always maintained, and various post-war settlements involved exchanges of territory irrespective of local populations. With the formation of the United Nations, however, and such organizations as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, later on, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, territorial integrity became a well-established part of international resolutions. The UN Charter in 1945 affirmed the obligation of states not to use force to alter state boundaries. You'll notice I keep emphasizing the responsibility of states not to use force, despite the fact that they're sovereign in their home. The recent post-World War II strict application of territorial integrity has given rise to a number of problems, especially when faced with reality. At the 2005 World Summit, the world's nations agreed on a new concept called responsibility to protect. This was supposed to allow a right for humanitarian intervention. It is argued that this can create a flexible application of concept of sovereignty and territorial integrity, easing the strict adherence and taking into account the de facto status of territory and other factors present on case-by-case basis. The UN Resolution 1674, adopted by the United Nations in 2006, April 28, reaffirms the provisions in paragraph 138, 139 of the 2005 World Summit outcome regarding responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In fact, this thinking is also part of what is informing South Africa's case against Israel to the International Court of Justice. However, this responsibility to protect refers only to the ability of external powers to override sovereignty and does not explicitly involve the changing of borders, as was the case in the Balkans. One thing is clear, however, that responsibility to protect is not a unilateral action. There needs to be a degree of international consensus to warrant such action in justifying what will constitute a violation of territorial integrity of a given nation state. In practice, R2P, as it's normally worded, has been used in limited instances. In Africa, neither genocide in Darfur or the apparent atrocities within the Horn of Africa was sufficient to attract actions in line with R2P, thereby raising questions on the viability of the concept in the work of complex geopolitics as well as internal dynamics. Our final concept here is going to be a concept of self-determination. Perhaps one of the most divisive issues in post-independent Africa has been the question of self-determination. As Ali Mazrui once noted in the famous work, The Triple Heritage, Africans, the Triple Heritage, that those who colonized Africa separated people who would otherwise have been together and pushed others together who would otherwise have been separate. Mazrui was responding to the dilemma of the question of the African state in the immediate aftermath of colonialism. Yet, despite the folly of the Berlin West Conference, colonial borders were largely accepted by post-independent countries as a way to maintain peace and avoid perpetual war. After all, newly independent African states were made up of many distinct nationalities that risked disintegration into unviable miniature states in the principle, or at least in the pursuit of self-determination, or if that were to be granted to everybody who demanded it. But what is it? Self-determination generally denotes a right of a people to decide their own destiny in the international world. It's a core principle of international law arising from customary international law, but also recognized as a general principle of law. And, of course, is enshrined in a number of international treaties. The right to self-determine is a cardinal principle of international law and binding, such as that in the United Nations Charter. It says that peoples, based on respect of their principle of equal rights and fair equality of opportunity, have a right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. This concept was first expressed in the 1860s and spread rapidly there. During World War I, this principle was encouraged by the Soviet Premier Vladimir Lenin, who came into power in 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. In response, or at the same time recognizing how the world was changing, President Woodrow Wilson announced his 14 points, January 1918. One of the points stated that national aspirations must be respected. People may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase. It is an imperative principle of action. During World War II, the principle was included in the Atlantic Charter, jointly declared on 14 August 1941 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was then the President of the United States, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who had pledged the 8 principal points of the Charter. It was recognized as an international legal right after it was explicitly listed as a right, of course, in the United Nations. But how has this manifested, especially in the colonized territory? Wilson's commitment to self-determination, at least to European states, during World War I, and the Bolshevik rise to power in Russia, had an impact in trying to push this debate. The Russians at the time supported the right of all nations, including colonies, to self-determination. Indeed, the 1918 Russian Constitution or Soviet Constitution acknowledged the right of secession for its constituent republics, the right to which they exercised after the fall of the Berlin. This presented a challenge to Wilson's more limited demands, and therefore in January 1918, Wilson issued the 14 points, among other things, calling for adjustment of colonial claims, insofar as the interests of colonial powers had equal weight with the claims of subject. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 led to Soviet Russia's exit from the war and nominal independence, of course, of Armenia, Finland, Latvia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, as well as Poland, through the fact that those territories were under German control. The end of the war led to the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czechoslovakia, and the union of the state of Slovenes, Croats and Serbs and the Kingdom of Serbia as new states out of the wreckage of the Habsburg Empire. However, the imposition of some states where some nationalities, especially Poles, Czechs, Serbs, and Romanians, were given power over nationalities who disliked and distrusted them. This was essentially used as a pretext for German aggression. The establishment, of course, the League of Nations as a symbol of emerging post-war order, one of its earliest tasks was to legitimize territorial boundaries of the new states, created out, of course, of the Ottoman Empire, as well as Germany. That happened in Asia and in Africa mostly. This principle did not extend in so far as to end colonialism, under the reasoning that the local populations were not civilized enough. The League of Nations was therefore assigned each territory that hitherto belonged to either the Germans or the Ottomans. In the African setting, once it became evident the organization of African politics would be informed by European nation state, it was inevitable that the leaders would settle on retaining the boundaries as created by colonialists. Demography, ethnography, and topography made it difficult for founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity to establish national borders or rational borders. As they say, you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors. On the other hand, returning to pre-colonial borders was impossible, since pre-colonial states were fluid and organized on a territorial basis, and would therefore not resonate with the world which was organized around territories defined by hard boundaries. The leaders feared that the process of redrawing boundaries might result to wars and threaten the stability of the continent and newly independent states. In 1964, OAU passed a resolution on border problems pledging member states to respect the frontiers existing on the achievement of national independence. The OAU Charter, which was the constitutive instrument of Organization of African Unity, provided Article 3, Paragraph 3, for the respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity for each state and for its inalienable right to independent existence. The states referred to by the UN Charter were thus the states as mapped by the Europeans during colonialism. As a result, African boundaries have remained almost unaltered since independence. One of the most significant challenges of the frontiers inherited from colonial administrations was that the borders were drawn by Europeans in the late 19th century, particularly after the 1884 1885 conference, without knowledge and interest of the political, social, and regional peculiarities. They were drawn for the benefit not of the locals, but the colonialists to aid them in extracting resources and managing their colonial territories, on the basis of longitudes as well as latitude. Therefore, the creation separates states and communities that belong together, of course, prompting efforts for self-determination. It is important to note that self-determination is a right recognized by international law, as well as recognized by United Nations Charter. Yet, years after colonialism, only a fraction of cases have managed to exercise this right. Not simply because of the complexity of such action, but also due to pragmatism. It is tempting to seek divorce with larger politics when we feel dissatisfied. Oftentimes, there are legitimate grievances against the whole. Yet, as we ponder the future of the continent, we must ask ourselves tough questions. Is the current status quo viable? Will a new approach to these concepts lead to peace and progress? Are we prepared for the consequences of a change to emerging consensus? In a world that is fast integrated, of what utility it is for us to jealously hang on to these concepts? Should there be a middle ground where we can negotiate sovereignties, territories, and find determination in our affairs within more viable halls. And I mean more viable halls because there is a tendency that when we're dissatisfied with the state, we want to chart our own path. The trouble is we're always going to tend to become smaller and weaker, no matter how justified and founded that can be. We were once young nations, and we perhaps lack the competence and understanding to seek change that reflects our aspirations. Today, we have come of age, and we have an obligation to provide direction, not just for the present generation, but for the future generation. Playing victim is no longer justified. Establishing agency and remaking the continent in our own image is a sacred obligation. This is not to diminish differences that we have, nor does it downplay the pain we have sometimes caused each other. But as one great American once said, though passions may have hurt, they should not break our bonds of affection. After all, in the spirit of Ubuntu, I am because you are because we are. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.